So then my like long-time recruiter was like, Kate, you're more likely to go to the spa, fall asleep, and cook yourself. And I'm like, okay, well, that is a legitimate risk, right? So then I got super creative, and I like invented this hypothetical replacement. I'm like, okay, if something happened to me, they would have to hire somebody else. So I named him Dave. And because we live in a patriarchy, I paid him more than me, right? And so I told my director, I'm like, look, I went to the spa. I never came back. Now you have Dave. Dave does half as much for you, and Dave expects you to do twice as much for him. So what do you need to survive Dave? And so 2 people told me they would quit. One person was like, I could do your job. I would have a go. I was like, well, what is your plan? He's like, well, first, I would have to find out what your job is. And then I would just do all of it. And I was like, that is not a plan. Anyway, so we had these conversations about Dave. We all hate Dave. That's fine. And then we started to be like, okay, well, like, Dave is actually goals. Are we recording? It's a little red dot up at the top, Debo. You don't need to worry about this. It's fine. Yeah. There we go.
I'm done. Okay, let's get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of the If Then podcast. This is your host, Debo Ray, and today we are joined by Cate Huston, our Director of Engineering at DuckDuckGo. Cate, it's awesome to have you with us today. Thank you for taking the time. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Cate, before we get started, we have a tradition on this podcast where we ask our guests what their most memorable meal from the recent past was. What was yours?
I think it's like the first meal after I got out of somewhere where there was like no food, you know? So like the Langham Hotel in Beijing after getting back from North Korea and just like not eating for 6 days. Like, I don't even remember what it was exactly, but just I was clean. I was not hungry for the first time in a week. Incredible.
I'll have to find some time after this episode to learn more about this experience. This sounds fascinating. Nice. So, Kate, you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, I work in across client engineering at DuckDuckGo, so native applications and front end. I've been there for a bit over 4 years. Before that, I was at Automatic. So I feel like everybody's talking about returning to an office, and I'm like, what even is an office? Like, I was doing this before it was cool. I'll be doing it for a long time afterwards. Yeah.
So, Kate, I know you care a lot about the engineering leadership, the strategy, etc. side of the house. Maybe we can start with diving into that topic. Do you have any core principles or strategies that you like to follow?
You know, like Tanya Riley, when she wrote the foreword for my book, she wrote like, Kate's philosophy is everybody gets to feel how they feel, and then you get shit done. And I'm like, oh, that is actually like very succinctly summarized my like core philosophy.
How do you build that into your teams?
I think you have to like show up and give a damn about people, but be kind of uncompromising about moving things forward. And moving things forward, not just like on the day-to-day, but I think a lot about like the medium term, you know, like the retention rates for my team are very high. Because like if somebody needs a personal day, I'm not going to be like, no, sacrifice everything to do it today. Yeah. But like over the long term, because people feel heard, they feel supported, they achieve more, you know, in a medium time frame.
See, like, and on a tactical or even on a day-to-day or a week-over-week basis, are there certain things that you do to essentially inculcate this sentiment and feeling within the team?
Yeah, so I did the whole full coactive coach training. And so it's like kind of a core principle in coaching is like, you know, you see where somebody's at, you meet them where they're at, but they leave with actions, you know? So if somebody comes to a one-on-one with me and they're pissed off, they get to be pissed off, but they're going to leave with some things to do.
Yeah. I see. This is very cool. And we need to get a little bit more into this as well. So, Kate, I know you have recently written a book on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
The book is called The Engineering Leader Strategies for Scaling Teams and Yourself, if I recall correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I
Mm-hmm.
actually have ordered a copy as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Um, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so the book's in two halves. The first half is about you, and the second half is about the teams you lead. And for me, that's really important because, like, just core to this is the idea that, like, you can't give what you don't get, right? But that doesn't mean you need to get it from your boss. Like, you can only be a good boss if you have a good boss. It's like if you can figure out how to meet your own needs, then you can still be a great boss if you don't have a good boss or you don't have a boss at all, right? So that's why the first half starts with you. It's that again is in two pieces. The first one is just about like how to think about your career, how to take responsibility for it, how to take ownership of it. And then the second half is about this idea that I've been calling self-management. So how do you manage yourself if your boss is not managing you, or even if they are, you're going to get more out of them if you've kind of met 80% of your own needs and you bring them the last 20% that you can't do yourself. So that's the self-management section. The second half of the book is about teams. The first half of that is about how do you build a functioning team ecosystem where people can thrive. And then the second half is like, how do you make teams self-improving?
How do you make teams self-improving?
I think you have to instill in them a sense of collective responsibility and agency. They have to feel that they can move things forward. But I think one of the core things that stops teams from being self-improving is that they don't have the information needed to make decisions. So if you're very intentional about what I call your layers of communication, so mission, strategy, tactics, execution, then people can make decisions inside of them because they know what's important and why.
But see, Kate, still, I used to work at Uber for a little bit, and often, like being able to access information that you could essentially incorporate into the micro decisions that always have to get made so many times during a day, like that wouldn't be the easiest thing on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And like as a company matures more, all of these various compliance, etc., things also start to kick in, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore, like the the end engineer, the one or the end product person that's trying to move the needle somewhere, like often it becomes a Herculean task to go and actually access that information.
Right. You're
So
totally
yeah,
right. Like if you have a meeting culture, if you have a culture where like information is power, it's going to be really hard to get to this. But you have to, I think there's many like anti-patterns of failure as management. Like I'm the person who has the information and makes the decisions and that makes me important. And you have to let go of that, and you have to start being like, I'm the person who gets the information and makes sure that it is presented in an orderly way.
and so that way you're empowering the teams to essentially operate off of that,
Yeah.
whatever the outcomes of
I think
that.
whenever I find something that's like not super clear, like I just start making a document or organizing it in some way, and then it's amazing, like how useful that is. Like, firstly to me because it makes the gaps that I have much clearer, and secondly to other people because I can almost always share it. Maybe I can't share 100% of it, but I can normally share at least like 50+ percent.
Yeah, no, this makes sense. Switching gears a little bit, Kate, what are the things you're working on right now?
Building web browsers that people can use for their everyday browsing whilst also protecting their privacy.
Why is that hard? I'm
So
sure it's hard. I'm just
if you
starting
built
with
a
the
web
assumption
browser,
that it's hard.
if you built a web browser, like the web is just like kind of very much works on my machine, right? Like compatibility, and I think when you're in the privacy space, you're in this kind of constant competition with like as many people whose livelihood depends on being able to follow people around the web and sell them shit, and you're trying to stop as much of that as possible. Like that, this work will continue forever.
Yeah. And so is it mainly around understanding a lot of the core JavaScript frameworks that are around and available today? Like, is that the layer where most of the challenges exist?
Yeah, so there's a few different challenges, right? So one is in like web compat, which is a big problem, making sure that websites are compatible, making sure that that if a website's broken, you can find out without having people complain to you about it, and doing all of this whilst not collecting any personal information, like makes it another dimension. Then you have like on iOS and Mac OS, we have like thread safety is actually really big, because the way that tracking protection works on the Apple platforms is that you basically compile a giant regex. And so that gets processed in the background on a different thread. And so you want to know when it's done, you want to know what's happening. And it creates a ton of like really difficult threading problems.
So in order to tackle a challenge or an opportunity like this, how do you choose to structure your teams?
Yeah, so DuckDuckGo follows, I think it's like the Spotify squad model. So we have functional teams, which are platform based. So Apple, Android, Windows, front end. And then we have objectives that all have a specific goal. So we have an objective for desktop browsers, for example. We have an objective for our mobile browsers, and those are cross-functional objectives. Includes engineering and product and user experience and all the rest of it. And I calculated this out recently, and my team's across 16 objectives. The objectives tend to be quite small.
Okay.
So then, the teams on them tend to be quite small.
So now, if you're working on, let's say, a collection of these objectives, right, across the team, does maintaining team cohesion become a problem? Because Bob might be working on something, Sally is working on another component, and are they actually able to like talk to each other and like find some common ground and learn from each other?
I think it can be really hard. I think the team that has the easiest time of this is the one that was all together for a long time, and they've just started to split up and be in different places. So they have something to come back to. Whereas like another one of my teams was never in the same place, had grown apart for a long time before I got it, and I think is still inclined to be like, oh, well, why are we a team at all? If you prioritize it, right? If you like care about it and you iterate on things and you try to make people feel like a team, you can make a group of people, even doing pretty disparate things, feel like a team. But definitely, like, some things are harder than others, right? Like the number one easiest way to make a team is to unite them against a common enemy. Now, this is not a good idea, but it really works super well, right? Like, short term does not work long term. But short term, if you want a group of people to bond and feel like a team, you give them a common enemy, and they'll be like so well bonded, right? But if you have a group of disparate people, they don't have a common enemy. Well, like, you don't want to let them have a common enemy. So that might help. You need to kind of come at it in a different way and try and get them to see that like they have way more in common than they do different.
I know you were mentioning from a engineering leadership strategy perspective that you like to focus on the medium-ish term for the most part. So is this a strategy that you consider undertaking from time to time, like finding a common enemy somewhere to bring people together?
No, I don't personally use this strategy, but many people use this strategy.
Okay. So it sounds like your team is essentially structured by some group, the platform groups, and then folks are picking up different objectives. How do you understand that we're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, so this is what comes back to like the first topic we had of like, is the mission written down? Is the strategy written down? So at a company level, all the objectives are expressed in a way that supports the overall company mission.
I see. Okay. And if whatever work I'm doing, it delivers against that objective, and therefore it has to go and deliver against the company missions. Okay.
Yeah, so this is harder for like infrastructure work, for example, but you just have to tell a better story about the infrastructure work and why it's important and what it gives you.
Yeah. Has the team always been structured like this?
No.
Oh.
When I joined, it was like, I think 8 people, and there was one team for native apps. And that was just Apple and Android. And then we added a Windows crew,
Mm-hmm.
and then we split the teams. And at some point, I picked up the front end team as well.
Okay. And so, trying to zoom in a little bit now, Kate, like we have these groups of people working on
Mm-hmm.
different platforms. They are all working on some level of objectives which have been prioritized based on
Mm-hmm.
some metric. How do you do anything on a week over week, month over month basis to understand, like, even if the team is moving forward, like, are there some metrics that you might want to consider or something that you have seen potentially be helpful in the past?
Yeah, so we use these like critical path tasks that are like, this is the
Hmm.
roadmap we expected to do. Where are we on the roadmap? That's what I find most useful. I'm responsible for like 70 plus people overall, so I'm not in anybody's roadmap that much right now. Like one of my
Yeah.
directs is mostly doing that. So they look at, there's a lot of focus on like, what did we say we would do in what time, and did we manage to do it, kind of for good and for bad, right? I think it can incentivize people to pad their estimates, but also we don't have projects going off the rails for 3 months and nobody knows about them. Like that can't happen.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. And then, we look at kind of normal, we don't have analytics because we don't track people's behavior, but we have metrics, right? And so distinction between that, I feel like analytics is, what somebody was doing, who their friends are, their phone number, their profile picture, and how all their actions link together. It's like, that's what I think of as analytics.
Yeah.
And metrics is like, we know how many people opened the app today, but we don't know anything about those people.
Yeah.
We know how many people use the fire button, but we have no way to say, or we know how many times the fire button was used, but we actually don't know if everybody used it once, or if like a third of the people used it 3
Yeah.
times, or anything like that, right?
Kid, I remember when we chatted a little bit back, you had mentioned some things around, like, sure, there's the aspect of the manager job of like being able to operate the team effectively, and there's also like, how do you improve yourself? How do you improve?
Mm,
How do we create an environment wherein my directs can essentially, they are also constantly improving and also helping me improve? Any
mm.
strategies, tactics over there that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, I'll tell you my most useful one, which so I was trying to get my leads to think about scaling more. I could see we were going to run into some limitations, and I kept talking to them about scaling, and it wasn't working, right? And so then one day, one of the recruiters pinged me and was like, Kate, who would do your job if you weren't doing it? And I was like, oh, the bus factor question. I'm like, nobody, but it's okay because I never take the bus. So then my longtime recruiter was like, Kate, you're more likely to go to the spa, fall asleep, and cook yourself. And I'm like, okay, well, that is a legitimate risk, right? So then I got super creative, and I invented this hypothetical replacement. I'm like, okay, if something happened to me, they would have to hire somebody else. So I named him Dave. And because we live in a patriarchy, I paid him more than me, right? And so I told my directs, I'm like, look, I went to the spa, I never came back. Now you have Dave. Dave does half as much for you, and Dave expects you to do twice as much for him. So what do you need to survive Dave? And so 2 people told me they would quit. One person was like, I could do your job, I would have a go. I was like, well, what is your plan? He's like, well, first I would have to find out what your job is, and then I would just do all of it. And I was like, that is not a plan. Anyway, so we had these conversations about Dave. We all hate Dave. That's fine. And then we started to be like, okay, well, Dave is actually goals, right? Like Dave has free time. He can go golfing, not that any of us, I think, want to go golfing, but it'd be nice to have the time to go golfing, right? So then we just started thinking about scaling totally differently. And we started asking ourselves the question of how can we be more like Dave? And that meant that sometimes we didn't, when one of our directs was having a bad time with something, if you're a caring person, you just want to fix it for them, right? And we stopped doing that kind of thing. Not completely, but we stopped defaulting to that and started sometimes being like, here's what I can give you to help you equip you to this problem. And it was incredible. People started stepping up, like way more. Like Dave is perhaps, like I would say, I have a lot of gratitude for Dave. Maybe he does deserve to be paid more than me.
So, Kate, as part of like collecting this feedback and going through these exercises, is there something that you have changed in your day-to-day behaviors, patterns, and how you operate?
Yeah, I stopped assuming that I was the default backstop for people who report to me, and I expected them to find somebody else. And like, yeah, I'm 100% their backstop, but there better be somebody else there too,
Yeah. And I'm assuming that also helps you not get burnt out, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, I mean, I have like 8 directors and a staff engineer that I'm responsible for. Like it's just a lot,
Yeah.
I can't be in people's details. Like I can't effectively do their job when they're gone because I just don't know enough about it. I don't have time to understand the details of 9 people's work,
Changing tracks slightly, how do you, like from a core business perspective, given your position on the engineering team, I'm sure you have to deal with some of the business leaders, etc., in the company. How do you talk about your team? How do you justify your team to the business?
I think I'm really lucky because I've always worked in kind of engineering driven companies where I don't have to justify my team so much. Like normally I have like more headcount than I even ask for. But I do think you have to be cognizant. I think it's harder when I'm looking at infrastructure teams, So when I'm trying to build out 2 new teams that will be more infrastructure based, and like how do I talk about them to the business is way more challenging because normally these are driven by the thing that's not honestly that much of a problem now, or the business isn't noticing as a problem, but it's like this will be a problem in time, like each release costs this much time and like we need it to cost less time. And then, one of the things I do is I always like take my opportunity. So when something like goes sideways, I'll be like, oh, would it be good if we had feature flags here, huh? And then I just like add it to my list of like, like sometimes I think the thing that I've got better at over time is like just being patient and waiting for some things to fall. Even if they're obvious to me, like they're not necessarily obvious to other people until there have been some problems. So like if those problems aren't critical, it's okay to let those problems happen and use them to be like, look, this is why I think it's critically important that we stop doing these things.
I guess patience is a component that I'm getting from multiple of your comments. Okay. And that
I
is
think
something I have to learn.
I think I have had to learn to be way more patient. Like you just can't like scale being impatient. You want everything done immediately. It's faster to do it yourself. And then at some point you just have too much to do. I'm sorry, am I looking into your soul right now?
Slightly.
Okay, well, there we go. I believe in your capacity to change, Deborah.
No, this is awesome. Okay. Because you mentioned releases, etc., in the example, how do you generally think about developer experience, ergonomics, etc.? Because I know you have you worked at Automatic, and then you had also had a good chunk of time at Google. How has that shaped you?
I think I have some minimum expectations, but also like in client engineering, you just get a lot from the platforms, like the Xcode and Android Studio and the whole ecosystem that goes with it. They invest a lot in developer experience. So if you're focusing on client engineering, you don't necessarily need to invest that much yourself. I think where you can meaningfully build a better developer experience and it is worth doing it is in your release process. Because like if you think about app development, right? Like are you a back-end servery person if you carried a pager?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So client engineers, like, I'm not speaking for all of them, but I think many of us, myself included, we're not good in a crisis, right? But we actually know when our incidents would happen, and it would happen almost certainly related to our release train. There's very few incidents that wouldn't relate to the release train. So if you can control your release train, you can essentially schedule your incidents, catch them early, and mitigate them quickly.
Okay, so the process essentially helps on the ops side, which then, okay, this is really interesting. I hadn't considered the number of benefits that you get from each of the platforms and the dev tooling in that ecosystem. This is really
I
cool.
mean, it varies, right? Like there's a bit less on, like on macOS, you can obviously put things out through the App Store, but you don't have to. And so then you end up needing to like use some tool. We use Sparkle to do a kind of phased rollout setup.
Nice. So as part of this, then, Kate, how do you work with, let's say, your counterparts on the product side of the house at like figuring out prioritization? Because we all have a limited number of like hours, even in our teams. So how have you learned might be a good way to handle prioritization and understanding the returns for each of the investments that we make on a let's say on an objective by objective basis. How do you do it?
Yeah. So we run our objectives on a tiered system. So there's tier 1 objectives, there's tier 2 objectives. They're all important, otherwise they won't be happening, but tier 1 is more important than tier 2. This has been a great improvement because it used to kind of rely on like some people who just knew, you know? Yeah. And I remember missing something and my boss was like, well, I said this was a priority. And I was like, sure, but I thought that meant that and not that, you know? And because it was open to interpretation, right? And now it's just not, it's like really clearly laid out, tier 1, tier 2, everybody knows, and it's used as a framework to make decisions. And so then we don't have to deviate from that very often. And when we do, it's kind of like looking at like, what does this block? What does this unlock? You know, why is like, you can have a more nuanced conversation when you're having it about fewer things, basically.
Because I know you all have a pretty distributed team generally as well. How does that work out? Like these sorts of communications, it normally I've seen like when people are hanging out together in some capacity, even on our team, we like to get together at least a couple of times a year, just to like go and argue about some things, etc. How do you all tackle that problem? Curious to learn.
So we do a lot in writing, but the whole company meets up once a year. Actually, everybody else is the meetup, but you go to North Korea one time, you're not allowed in the US anymore, so I'm not there. But then we have team-specific meetups. So people get together there. But I think I used to believe that meetups were really important. Before the pandemic, I used to go to a lot of them. I used to spend a lot of time facilitating them. And DuckDuckGo has, like, I switched to DuckDuckGo during the pandemic, and DuckDuckGo has a slightly different attitude to meetups. Like, they're more like junkets, whereas Automatic was very much like, the ideal meetup is that you all get together and do a project together and ship it in the meetup. Okay. But DuckDuckGo, they were always more like junkets. And so I kind of ended up shifting my mindset to think that actually your weekly meetings are more important, and that time should be used really intentionally, and that you should iterate on those meetings to like keep them fresh and keep them useful. And that, you know, I generally think I think like a meeting should be like more spicy. Like if the meeting's boring, no one should be there.
Yeah.
Because that could easily be replaced by text.
And does that mean like wearing a very weird looking beanie in a meeting sometimes, or does it mean something else?
I mean, like starting an argument, like having like the real conversation that's like more important and more deep. Like I think sometimes the reason why people think remote works better that in-person works better than remote is because people get to the important conversations and they just do it in a meandering way, you know? So they like spend the day together, they go and do some pool, and then they finally had their 2 beers and they're like, okay, so I'm really worried about this, right? Like that's inefficient for starters.
Yeah.
But like I see why people think it works. But I think you could just get to those important things faster, you know, especially if you are really listening to people, if you're being intentional about things. Like the meetings that I run, I like to start by asking everybody to say how they feel. Like just one feeling. And it doesn't matter what it is, because if you and it's in coaching, it's a process called clearing, right? It's like if you don't say what's there, it's going to come out later. So it's more efficient if we all know what's there and what people's energy is, because otherwise you dance around the topic and then at the end of the meeting you ask somebody to do something and they get really mad and you're like, why did that happen? But if you ask them the first how they felt and they're like, oh, I'm really overwhelmed and this thing's going sideways, then you would know that you shouldn't ask them to do one more thing,
Yeah. Is working across time zones, does it add an additional challenge or does that help?
I think you have to be intentional. Like I've always thought that remote work makes the problems of work more obvious and then you can just set about trying to address them.
In your teams today, is there something you try to do around keeping people within somewhat of a similar part? Not at all.
No, because I don't want to constrain people's work based on their time zone, right? And if somebody is in Australia and they want an opportunity, then I might be like, look, you got to know this opportunity is going to mean 2 a.m. meetings. That's going to suck for you maybe. But it's their decision whether or not they want it, right?
Yeah.
But it's not my decision to be like, oh, I don't want this person to have a 2 a.m. meeting, so therefore I'm going to deny them the opportunity. Yeah. It's their decision.
Oh, cool. No, that's great to hear. I've actually learned of a couple of interesting tidbits from this conversation that I want to apply in at least myself.
Awesome.
So that's been good. So, Cate, before we wrap up, anything else you want to share with us today? Any other topics?
I hate this question. Just, please buy my book. I spent 2 years writing it. Every sale makes that 2 years of my life feel more worthwhile. So, yeah.
You have one in me, and we'll ask essentially the producer of this show, Shani, to also go and buy one. I'll make sure.
Amazing, worth it. I spent 1 hour and I sold 2 books, so that's great.
Excellent, yes. No, with that, then we can wrap up today. Thank you so much for joining us, Cate. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you.